Hello and welcome. My name's Ryan Johnson, and this is the Saltcast. Today, I welcome Jason Parr and Danny Wright. Welcome, guys.
Hey Ryan, good to be with you. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
It is definitely a glorious morning here in the mountains of Idaho. But today, I want to talk a little bit about Colorado, a little bit about Minnesota. It's been more specifically about the retail delivery fee. It's been about a year since we talked about you know, businesses needing to implement Colorado's new retail delivery fee. It'd be great if you guys could remind us what that is, you know, kind of the burden that was put on to retail businesses with that. But then I believe Minnesota is kind of following in Colorado's footsteps on that. And maybe we can expound on that and help our listeners be more prepared with what's coming up.
Yeah, it's everybody's favorite topic, right? Additional fees imposed by states separate from the sales tax, but kind of on the coattails of a sales tax and the state's abilities to reach beyond their borders through economic nexus legislation to require companies to collect and remit their sales tax. And out of the blue, we have these fees, these delivery fees being imposed first by Colorado and now Minnesota. I think theirs goes into effect July 1 of 24. So we're a little over a year out from the effective date of that fee. But it's kind of a sore subject for me because I question whether states really have the authority to impose additional fees on outside sellers that's not a sales tax. The Wayfair case is specific to sales tax. It's specific to transactions that sales tax would be imposed upon. And even these two fees are essentially imposed on the same transactions that would be subject to a sales tax. So the reason it's a sore subject is because we really pride ourselves in being able to provide really great answers to how to be compliant and manage your sales tax processes, issues that come up, questions and concerns that you have, etc. What is the answer for this? All of the big players that provide return services struggle with it because how do you track it? How do you apply it? How do you remit it? It's on separate forms than the regular sales tax forms. But more importantly, on that front end, when you're implementing someone's invoice system um, into a tax automation that allows you to collect the right amount of tax on the right items that are taxable in a given state. And now you have this fee. In Colorado is fairly straightforward, but Minnesota's is a little bit more complex because it's only on transactions greater than $100. There's an exemption out there on companies that do less than a million in gross sales, and that's questionable on whether it's total gross sales across the nation or if it's gross sales directly into Minnesota. We know that marketplace facilitators have an exemption up to 100,000, and they're certainly going to exceed that and be required to. I say collect this amount, but the fee can be in Colorado. It's imposed on the transaction, and it should be presented to the customer separately on the invoice as a fee. But they allow, understanding that it's hard to implement this, they allow the purchaser, I'm sorry, the seller to pay this fee themselves out of their own pocket. Well, how gracious,
What a great
right?
privilege. Thank you.
Minnesota says Minnesota says that the seller can pay this amount or they can collect it from their customer. So now you have a fee that can make you more or less competitive, or maybe you pocket that amount, maybe your customer goes to someone who doesn't collect it and you remit it out of your own pocket or whatever the case may be. But just the mere implementation of one new fee, right? Minnesota says it's just a 50-cent fee. And we don't even hit small companies. I mean, you have to make more than $1 million before you even subject to it.
And it's on transactions more than $100, right?
Yeah. So it's just a simple fee, yet quite complex to manage. And if you have a lot of transactions into Colorado or Minnesota, and you're not picking this fee up, you're not putting it on the invoice, and it has to be separately stated on the invoice or it wasn't ever collected. It can't be included, right? So it's not like you can add 50 cents to the transaction and say, hey, it's included in there. You can do that and pay it out of your own pocket, but it's got to come out of your own pocket. So it's got to be shown, it's got to be visible, it's got to be separately stated. It's only on the whole transaction, right? It's not on every transaction on the invoice. It seems to be on every transaction, which I would think is an invoice, but you've got to be able to specify that and manage that. So it's contradictory to my nature to throw out all of these problems without solutions. Danny, maybe you want to chat a little bit about, what's the practical approach to this or your thoughts on it?
Well, I'll push back a little on that. And it's more as a question of like, do you really have to separately state on the invoice? Because the understanding that I have is that the retailer can pay that fee. So as long as they're filing that return that the state requires and paying the fee, it'll be, of course, connected to the transactions, like you said. So I actually question whether or not you would have to show it on any invoice.
Yeah, if you're going to collect it from the customer, it would have to be shown as a separate transaction. You'd have to be able to show an auditor. I mean, are they going to start auditing on these fees? You would have to show an auditor that it was collected from the customer. But yeah, a seller, I suppose, could just increase all of their transactions by 50 cents, and they could pay it out of their own pocket. But obviously, it's still going to be transferred to the customer by increasing the fee on their goods. So let's talk solutions. The way we've been handling the Colorado retail delivery fee is some have been able to add some line in their billing system or their invoice system, but for the most part, what I'm seeing, at least with a lot of our clients on their sales into Colorado, they're simply paying that out of their own pocket. They're picking it up. And the bigger players in automation, Vertex and Sovos and Avalara and others, they seem to have found a way to add this fee and show this fee, or to give back the 27-cent rate as it relates to that fee. But remember, another reason this complicates it is because these providers are providing accurate tax rates on taxable sales based on research and coding that they've provided that attaches and gives you real-time feedback so that you can have a large volume of transactions occurring all the time across e-commerce platforms and other types of platforms. So they're not built to return a 27-cent fee or a 50-cent fee on the transactions that are coming through on the system. And so they're in a little bit of a uphill battle, which puts the sellers in an uphill battle, which really creates a roadblock to collecting the fee. And so the fee ends up resting upon the seller, I guess. Oh, here's the other thing about Minnesota, right? Colorado, at least, it's fairly straightforward, and there's not a lot of complicating issues around, hey, you just need to show it on the invoice. You need to collect it at this percentage on each transaction. And it escapes me, Colorado might also have some sort of safe harbor threshold that you need to pass. But in Minnesota, if you're going to put it on
it's 500,000.
Oh,
They do have a
500,000.
threshold of
Okay.
500,000, but I think that's newer. I mean, that wasn't initially the case. At
Gotcha.
some point, they passed
In
that
Mi- in
or established threshold.
in Minnesota, you have to actually, it's not just a RTD. It's not just a retail delivery fee, but you have to indicate that it's a retail delivery fee for road improvements and food service fee. So you have to say what the fee is for, what it helps or promotes. And again, I imagine at some point down the line, somebody's going to litigate as more and more states pick up different fees. I mean, if you can impose a retail delivery fee, that means you can also increase the retail delivery fee. It also means that, I mean, what other fees would you be prohibited from including? I mean, how many fees could Colorado essentially impose upon the seller? Could you have a dozen fees to send
That's
products into the state of Colorado?
that's the big issue. Like, no matter what your stance is on taxes, generally, right? I mean, you can go down that rabbit hole in a hurry and have it's a volatile discussion, right? But with all that said, like the pulling a fee out of nowhere and just saying I'm going to charge this and I can charge this, and the fact that it went all the way through the legislative process to the point where the governor signs off on it, I mean that can be scary for sure. And you know, there's so much you could unwrap just within the issue itself, and you know, we're not necessarily here to do that, but it's
Yeah,
interesting, like you say, how complex this particular one is. And I think part of the complexity probably actually comes to the credit of the people involved in passing this. I look at it and say, I mean, it really is less punitive on the small businesses, right? The fact that there's that $1 million threshold, the fact that it only applies to transactions over $100, like, thank you for that. Again, like it's kind of a backhanded, like, let me smack you across the face, but I won't smack you as hard as, you know, I could.
and yeah, and for those that are smacked, it's a more complicated issue because you might overcollect or overcharge or overpay
Yeah.
because you have to manage transactions at the transaction amount level. Let me just give this briefly. To me, this is a really big deal because one of the greatest wars in world history, the Revolutionary War, was absolutely based on being taxed without representation, right? You cannot tax a people that aren't represented by the governing authority or whatever the case may be, right? Taxation without representation. Well, before the Constitution was organized, this is sales tax 101, um, tax law, federal law, constitutional law associated with sales tax law. Before the Constitution, every state had its right to impose tariffs and fees and other funds on any transfer of goods from one state to another state because each state was its own government. And you could try to move something from anywhere in the U.S. to somewhere else in the U.S. I mean, again, we're at 13 colonies at this point. But anyway, as you're moving that product at every state line, they're adding tariffs to the point that the tariffs were greater than the goods themselves. And so they said, okay, we got to figure out a way to fix this, right? So the Due Commerce Clause in the Constitution allows for the process that we don't inhibit interstate commerce by adding additional fees that interrupt the ability and the smooth process of interstate commerce. So I just can't imagine that we're not going to get to a point where more states start imposing these different fees or tariffs or whatever the case may be, that somebody's not going to file a lawsuit and say, I just don't think the states have the right to do this. We're not represented by this state. We the to have a tariff on goods coming into the state. The way the state will argue that is it's not just a tariff on goods coming into the state. It's also a fee that's due by retailers within the state who make a delivery by some sort of transportation. And so if the good is transferred on a vehicle of some sort, then the fee is due. So they're going to say it doesn't discriminate against in-state retailers and out-of-state retailers. But it's hard for me to believe that the states can reach out across state lines and say, yeah, you need to pay this fee. And then what's the end of it? I mean, is there a limit on fees
At
that
what
a
point is
state
a
can
line
impose
drawn?
on transactions? Yeah, it's a very
that's
interesting time that we're in.
That's a great point. It's a great point because you can say, well, Minnesota, right? This is a Minnesota law. They have representation there, but this does not apply to just people in Minnesota. So you can flip the argument, right? If the state says, well, it doesn't just apply to out of state retailers. Well, exactly. Like it applies to people in your state, and that's fine, but it doesn't just apply to them. So if you want to pass a law that just
this is an
applies to
unintended
Minnesota retailers, be my guest and let the Minnesota people deal with that. But even then, right? Like I'm happy to have that conversation and discuss it. It's just the bottom line.
Yeah,
with
this is an unintended consequence.
It like you say, it affects interstate commerce, and that's an issue. And hey,
right,
for some people, this might be a call to action because
Wayfair overcame that.
Yeah.
And I think this is an unintended consequence of Wayfair. When the states have always wanted to tax sellers across the nation, sending goods into their states, but they really haven't ever been able to until this Supreme Court case. But I think what can happen is you can believe that a law allows for fairness, allows for the approach for things to be managed more simply, and the state can say that you do have some representation in the state when your goods are transferred into that state. And so Wayfair allowed the states to have this reach, but good law can have bad unintended consequences, which are how limited are the states to just impose fees on all transactions of goods coming into their state?
They're limited by their imagination.
Because
what can you imagine up? How can you imagine and create a way to tax the people and call it something that becomes acceptable to the point where it gets passed and the governor actually signs off on it? That's the limitation at this point. Seems to be their imagination.
Yes. Good point. Valid point. So. Hate not to have any great solutions for everyone, and this is one of those podcasts where maybe we've put out a lot of questions and maybe we have vented a little bit to the audience, but maybe in this approach we've commiserated with you just a little bit, which is not our nature, but we're kind of at a point of disbelief that it's really moving forward this way. But we do want to help companies manage this fee. We can't help you litigate this fee. We can help you in an audit scenario.
We have a year. We have a year to
definitely
fight
help
this.
you manage it.
We're revolutionaries now.
I can only. That's right. I mean, that just got my blood pumping. I was ready to start fighting, taxation without representation. Like, you're right. We're here to fight with you guys. But we're also here to help. If the fighting doesn't turn out, in our favor or in your favor, with the delivery fees, we're ready to help you out. Make sure you're doing it right, and the audits don't come knocking.
In most situations, you have a fight or flight response, right? I like to tell people, I don't fight, I'm a lover, right? I'm not a fighter, I'm a lover. Our approach is fight or comply. You can fight or comply. And unless you have a really, really strong argument to fight, then you comply. And that's where we really come in to help. We can help you comply.
Especially finding a intersection of a practical approach for your business and compliance. Like where do those
Yeah.
intersect? Because in some cases, like, and this is an example. I mean, there won't be a one size fits all for the solution around these retail delivery fees, and so that really is us, right? You talk about our core values. It's information. It's thinking about you specifically, your situation, laying out all the information based on our experience, expertise, and just what we've seen out there, and ultimately lay these different options you have out and help you discuss the pros and cons, consider all the options, and then ultimately make a practical business decision that, like we're saying here, aligns with or intersects with compliance. So don't ignore it. If you're
Indeed.
going to, I won't even tell you not to fight it. If you're going to fight it, be a fighter, like do your thing. But, that we'll talk through options of, compliance and practicality.
Yep.
Well said. And I think with that, that's where we should end. I mean, that's exactly what needs to be said. So, guys, thank you so much for being on today, and we hope to see you on another one.
Take care.